Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Members, you may know, if not from the email I sent all of you yesterday during that other bill, that I'm a fan of movies. And I think movie scenes and movie lines can explain a lot about things in daily life, because great writers have great archetypes for their experiences, and it always teaches something to us. When I raised my hand down here to represent the people in my district of Minnesota, to make laws for them and represent them to the best of my ability, I was thinking about a movie scene in a movie that won Best Picture in 2000. It was Gladiator. And some people have heard me tell this story before, but there's a scene where the gladiator goes before the emperor, and they're on the front lines in Germania, and the emperor is dying, but the gladiator doesn't know it. And the emperor says to the gladiator, "Tell me again, Maximus, why are we here?" And the gladiator, who is the general at that time, says, "Well, for the glory of Rome, sire." And the emperor, who has grown old and cynical after fighting 25 years of unending war, responds, "Ah, yes, for the glory of Rome, I had forgotten." And then he goes on to tell a story to the general about how there once was an idea that was Rome. You could only whisper it. Anything more, and it would shatter. It was too fragile. And he talks about how Rome once was a republic, and it represented the people, and it represented all the people, and it had devolved into a state of anarchy, a military dictatorship where people were squabbling for their own interests and only thinking about themselves. And he had declared his intention upon his death, and his death was imminent, to make Rome a republic again, under the control of the Senate and represented by the people. It's our job, members, to represent the conscience of our people and of all the people. When I was in high school, we had a class play, and I wasn't in it, but it was 1776. And the conversation in that play in 1776, many of you have probably seen it, was about what would go in the Constitution and how the Constitution was developed. I remember this one line from it, and there was a sophomore named Mark who played the part of the delegate from North Carolina, and there was a scene. He said, "Mr. President, I haven't heard anything in this debate yet about securing deep-sea fishing rights." And it was a funny throwaway line in the play that everyone kind of rolled their eyes at. That this is a constitution. There's no place in here for deep-sea fishing rights. We're talking about heady matters of state. They're going to last, hopefully, for hundreds of years, which I'm imagining the founders of Rome thought as well. But members, the founders of the Constitution put the things they did in there for very specific reasons, and we must remember what they were thinking at the times that they wrote it. The founders' grandparents and great-grandparents lived through a period called the 30 Years' War. Now, they were from England, which was a part of Europe, and the 30 Years' War raged mostly through the empire on the continent, but they were still deeply affected by it and by many of the impacts later on. Because the 30 Years' War was fought from 1618 to 1648, and it was fought over religion. And the sects it was fought over were two, including in the list, the rather short list given out by the distinguished individual at the podium yesterday. I say distinguished in a denotative sense. He certainly distinguished himself. But they were both Christian sects. And members, during those 30 years, 1/3 of the people were killed, and 2/3 of the property was destroyed. The effects of that war, or those wars, impacted Europe and impacted the people living there for generations to come, including the founders of our Constitution. They remembered you do not stick religious ideals in constitutions. Not only that, but in the Constitution, you place things that protect people from the implementation of certain religious ideals, because that is the only way a republic stays strong. Here in Minnesota, the same thing happened. And it's funny because when states have to have their own constitutions, they need to be in concert with the federal constitution. They couldn't violate that in any way, because it has to be approved by the Congress. The Congress swears fealty to the United States Constitution. And in 1858, we in Minnesota were developing our own constitution. And at the time, our first governor, he expressed reservations about how you amend a constitution. At the time, at the beginning of our state and our place in the republic, you just had to have a simple majority on an amendment question for the general election. More votes won, less votes lost. As you know now, if this one goes on the ballot, you need to get a majority of all the votes cast, not just a majority of those people who answer yes or no. He said that this was important, that this should be difficult to amend the Constitution. He opposed this original version that made it easier because he said this would subject the Constitution to changes from feverish and temporary excitement, which have no place in a Constitution. That was our first governor, Henry Sibley. Our second governor, Alexander Ramsey, you all have heard probably more about him, because he was the guy who was in Washington, D.C. over the 2 days of April 12th and 13th, 1861, when Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina. And our governor rushed off to the White House and pledged his commitment to Abraham Lincoln that we would provide the first defenders of that union in the United States of America. Those young men became the first Minnesota Volunteers, and over the course of decades were reorganized by the Army into 135th Regiment, the unit of which both I and Representative Kriesel are honored to call home unit. That war, during the course of that war, that unit was absolutely decimated. It suffered casualties of 215 men out of 265 on July 2nd, 1863 at Gettysburg, and even more casualties throughout other battles, Antietam, Bull Run, of the rest of the war. And those young men returned home. Those that did return home, the people knew what they had fought for. They understood they had fought for freedom and the security of the Union based on a principle that all men were created equal. And yet, as Representative Paymar correctly stated, when they returned home, we put up a ballot question in 1865, authorizing Negroes to vote. That was the wording in 1865. After all those young men died, the amendment failed. Pine boxes returned home to Minnesota, and that amendment, the principle of which they had fought for, failed. Came up again in 1867, as Representative Paymar stated. Again, it failed. And in 1868, it finally passed. As he stated also, over the course of time, we tried to extend rights in our Constitution to women to vote. In 1875, women's suffrage in school affairs, that passed. 1877, women vote in local elections, that one was rejected, it didn't pass. In 1898, we asked for the right for women to vote and serve on library boards. Well, that one was approved. Ironically, though, that same year, 1898, another amendment was on the ballot, and that was approved. That amendment was to make it more difficult to amend the Constitution in Minnesota. It's the state we find ourselves in today where you can't just have a simple majority to pass a constitutional amendment. You got to have a majority of all the votes cast in that election. Now, members, why was this vote put on? Well, in 1898, the shadow of prohibition against the evils of the drink was raging in Minnesota. That was the raging battle. And the liquor lobby was concerned that it would rear its head in Minnesota and succeed as a constitutional amendment if it was that easy to amend the Constitution. So they funded a campaign and won that year. So the following general election in 1900, if you wanted a constitutional amendment passed, including prohibition or anything else, you had to have a majority of all the votes cast. Now, of course, they won that on the state level, but on the national level, you all well know, they didn't. That over a period of 15 years, roughly 1918 to 1933, we had prohibition in the United States. And it has me thinking sometimes, I wonder how many members served in this body in 1918 and in 1933. And how would they have voted? Did they change their vote? What happened? Because clearly the attitudes of society changed over the course of that time so drastically that entire national policy, not just a national policy, but the United States Constitution was amended affirmatively in 1918 and then negatively in 1933. Now, of course, we had to have a separate vote to affirm that or approve that in Minnesota, which we did. And people who are veterans of this body recall Marty Seifert talking about the breakdown of votes and the attitudes toward liquor and the evil of the drink in certain counties in Minnesota, some of which he claims still have active members of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement. But members, this is why it should be difficult to amend the Constitution. Because our founders had an idea that was America. Josiah King, we honored several weeks ago on the 150th anniversary of the 1st Minnesota Regiment. And Josiah King was 29 years old when the war broke out. He had traveled around the world. He was from out east, and he lived down south, and he made his way around the world across Cape Horn to California, planted some potatoes, and found his way to Minnesota. And he was 29 years old when the war broke out. And I'm reading here from a website that describes the 1st Minnesota. It says, not long after his arrival in St. Paul, Josiah joined the newly formed Pioneer Guards. When Governor Ramsey sent word to Lieutenant Governor Ignatius Donnelly back in Minnesota to raise a regiment of 1,000 men to help suppress the rebellion, Donnelly convened a meeting of the Pioneer Guards at the St. Paul Armory, just down the street. Those in attendance were told of the situation by their leader, Captain A.T. Chamblin. After several patriotic speeches, Chamblin decided to pass around the sign-up book. However, Josias reportedly bounded onto the stage before the book could be handed around and signed. One version has him declaring, "Here's another for the war," while another has him declaring, "I'll be the first to sign." He knew what he was fighting for. There was no question about what was going on in the papers at the time. Josiah was college educated. He went in as an officer. At the time, the South was claiming that this was not a war about slavery. This was simply a war about states' rights. The sanctity of states' rights, which should be inviolate. And the Republic was young back then. They may have had a stronger point during days when we didn't have as strong of a federal government as we do today. People were fiercely independent, and they were divided over the question of slavery. Members, I submit to you, though, that this amendment is no more about the sanctity of heterosexual marriage than the Civil War was about states' rights. Now, how is it going to be if this amendment passes and is passed by the voters next year at a general election? And 5 years, 10 years,
15 years down the road, like prohibition, want a different footing? How many people will still be in this body? And how many votes will change? I think of Strom Thurmond, who until Robert Byrd was the longest serving senator in the U.S. Senate. But he has another distinction that was not broken by Senator Byrd, which is that he has the longest filibuster ever conducted by a single senator, when in 1957 he sought to derail the Civil Rights Act and stood up on the Senate floor for over 24 hours speaking from the podium to filibuster the Civil Rights Act. Members, there are individuals outside who want to get married. They're a part of our republic. Those of you who know me and know my concerns know that I'm concerned about fractures in the strength of our republic, about those things that bring us together and about those that divide us. Marriage is something that brings us together. Do not let it be something that is enshrined in the Constitution to divide us. Members, please vote no.